The Vorthak Empire had perfected the art of civilized brutality over 17 millennia, which was roughly 16 millennia and 900 years longer than most civilizations managed before someone invented something unfortunately effective like orbital bombardment or universal healthcare. Their crown jewel was the Grand Colosseum of Xanthtar, a magnificent death trap that could hold 2 million screaming spectators and had probably seen more blood spilled than the average galactic war. The Empire took great pride in this statistic. Naturally, Emperor Thek-Mol the 19th, whose name translated roughly to "he who breaks things for fun" in the Old Tongue, had recently issued Decree 84-7b, which sounded bureaucratic enough to slip past most senators, but was actually a masterpiece of petty vindictiveness. Steel weapons were now banned from all gladiatorial combat. Not iron, mind you, not titanium or any of the 1,700 other metal alloys that could efficiently separate heads from shoulders. Just steel. The reason for this oddly specific prohibition sat in the luxury viewing box, picking her teeth with what appeared to be a sharpened femur. She was human, which meant she belonged to one of those irritatingly resourceful species that the galaxy kept underestimating right up until they started colonizing everything in sight. The Emperor had captured her 3 rotations ago during what historians would eventually call the unfortunate misunderstanding at Kepler Station, though the humans preferred the more direct, "That time you murdered our diplomats. You bastard." The woman called her the Terran, since names were for people who expected to survive long enough to use them, had already carved through 14 of the Empire's finest warriors using nothing but a chunk of recycled starship hull that technically qualified as steel. The Emperor found this embarrassing. His solution was elegantly simple. Ban the metal, watch the human flail helplessly with inferior weapons, then feed her to something with more teeth than a dental convention. What the Emperor failed to appreciate, with the sort of cosmic blindness that made his ancestors so successful at accidentally starting galactic incidents, was that humans had spent several 100,000 years killing things with whatever happened to be lying around. Before they discovered steel, they had been remarkably creative with bones, stones, pointy sticks, and the occasional bit of creative profanity. The Terran understood this perfectly. She also understood that the arena's foundation had been built on what was once a thriving ecosystem, back when Xanthtar had breathable atmosphere and wildlife that hadn't yet learned to fear the smell of industrial lubricants. Archaeological surveys were not typically conducted in gladiatorial venues, but 3 months of sleeping on stone floors had given her an intimate knowledge of the rock formations beneath her cell. The bones were everywhere if you knew how to look. Fossilized remains of creatures that had ruled this world when it was green and growing, buried under layers of imperial concrete and the accumulated disappointment of several geological ages. The guards, being Vorthak and therefore possessed of roughly the same geological awareness as a particularly dim meteorite, failed to notice when chunks of ancient predator began disappearing from the lower levels. In the maintenance tunnels that honeycombed the arena's foundation, the Terran had established what economists might charitably call a resource redistribution network. The other human gladiators, because the Empire never met a problem it couldn't solve by applying more of the same problem, had quickly grasped the possibilities inherent in their new circumstances. Fossilized bone, it turned out, could be knapped like flint, carved like wood, and sharpened to edges that would make surgical instruments jealous. The betting pools reflected none of this innovation. Vorthak bookmakers, operating under the reasonable assumption that soft pink mammals would crumble without their precious metal tools, were offering odds of roughly 4,000 to 1 against any human victory. This represented either magnificent confidence in imperial superiority or a stunning failure to research the species they were wagering against. Given that the Vorthak had once lost a war to a planet of sentient vegetables, the smart money was on the latter. The arena's upper levels buzzed with anticipation as the first post-steel matches approached. Spectators from across the Empire had traveled vast distances to witness what promised to be a delightfully one-sided massacre. The Zeraphim contingent had brought recording equipment. The Christine delegation was already composing elegies. Even the famously pessimistic Darlock had shown up, which was roughly equivalent to a solar eclipse in terms of statistical probability. None of them noticed the Terran testing the weight of what appeared to be an unremarkable chunk of fossilized calcium. None of them recognized the particular gleam that entered her eyes when she ran her thumb along its newly honed edge. And absolutely none of them had bothered to research what happened the last time someone told a human they couldn't use their favorite tools. The Emperor settled into his viewing throne, confident that Decree 8047B would finally put these troublesome mammals in their proper place. After all, what could they possibly accomplish without steel? History, as it so often does, was about to provide a comprehensive answer to that question. The discovery happened entirely by accident, which was how most significant archaeological finds occurred when the archaeologists in question were trying not to die in gladiatorial combat. The Terran had been excavating what appeared to be a particularly promising section of fossilized ribcage when her makeshift digging tool, a sharpened piece of hull plating that technically wasn't steel anymore due to several centuries of cosmic radiation, struck something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. The skull was magnificent in the way that apex predators tend to be magnificent, which is to say it was designed by evolution to be the last thing smaller creatures ever saw. It measured roughly 3 meters from snout to cranium, possessed dentition that would make a great white shark file a formal complaint with its union representative, and radiated the sort of ancient menace that suggested its original owner had enjoyed a diet consisting primarily of everything else that moved. More importantly, from the Terran's pragmatic perspective, its fangs were perfectly preserved, and approximately the size of ceremonial daggers. The kind of ceremonial daggers that happened to be excellent for non-ceremonial purposes, such as ventilating hostile alien anatomy. The creature had been some sort of terrestrial dragon, back when Zensar still had the sort of ecosystem that could support 30-meter-long murder machines with wings. Planetary records, hastily accessed through a combination of bribery and creative interpretation of maintenance worker credentials, identified it as a Drakthul, literally death that flies in the old Zensari. The species had ruled the planet's food chain for roughly 60 million years before a convenient asteroid had restructured their retirement plans. The irony was not lost on the Terran that the Empire had built their monument to controlled violence directly on top of the fossilized remains of uncontrolled violence. It was the sort of cosmic joke that the universe specialized in, like putting a pacifist in charge of a weapons factory, or making the galaxy's most warlike species lactose intolerant. Working by the dim luminescence of smuggled glow rods, she began the delicate process of extracting the Drakthul's primary weaponry. The fangs came free with the sort of satisfying crack that suggested they had been waiting eons for exactly this moment. Each one was roughly 40 centimeters of fossilized perfection, curved like a saber, and harder than most starship hulls. Evolution, it seemed, had already solved the problem of creating the perfect blade. It just took a human to recognize the solution. The other gladiators watched this development with the sort of keen interest that condemned prisoners typically reserved for escape plans and guard schedules. Word spread through the holding levels with the efficiency that only impending death could inspire. Within 2 rotations, every human in the complex knew about the first beast and its generous donation to their continued survival. The modification process required a delicate blend of engineering and wishful thinking. The fangs needed handles, which meant salvaging materials from every available source. Boot leather became grip wrapping. Torn uniforms provided binding cord. Even the nutritional paste dispensers yielded useful components when properly disassembled with sufficient motivation and a complete disregard for warranty provision. The Vorthak guards noticed none of this creative repurposing, partly because they possessed all the observational skills of a particularly myopic asteroid, and partly because they had been specifically instructed not to care what the humans did with their time. After all, what possible threat could unarmed mammals pose to the Empire's finest warriors? This question would soon join the ranks of history's greatest examples of famous last words, alongside classics like What Could Go Wrong, and The Humans Seem Harmless Enough. Meanwhile, in the betting parlors that surrounded the arena like parasites around a particularly profitable wound, the odds continued to reflect supreme confidence in human incompetence. The Christine delegation had actually improved their wager to 5,000 to 1, apparently convinced that removing steel weapons would reduce human effectiveness to somewhere below that of particularly aggressive houseplants. The Vorthak bookmakers were experiencing what economists called market confidence and what historians would eventually classify as catastrophic failure of imagination. They had calculated their odds based on careful analysis of human performance with standardized weapons, completely failing to account for the species' documented tendency to weaponize literally everything they encountered. This oversight would prove expensive in ways that extended well beyond mere monetary considerations. Emperor Thakmul himself was particularly pleased with the developing situation. His daily briefings indicated that human morale had reached what military analysts termed adequately despondent,
and betting revenues were approaching record levels. The first scheduled match was still 3 rotations away, but advance ticket sales suggested it would be the most profitable massacre in Imperial history. The Emperor's satisfaction was enhanced by reports from his champion, a 7-foot mountain of genetically enhanced muscle and bad attitude known as the Bone Crusher. The creature, for lack of a more charitable term, had been specifically bred for arena combat, possessed natural weapons that could pierce standard armor, and had never lost a match in 47 professional encounters. Pairing him against an unarmed human seemed almost unfairly one-sided, which was exactly the point. What none of them anticipated was the sight that would greet the first spectators to arrive early for optimal seating. In the pre-dawn hours before the arena's official opening, when only maintenance staff and compulsively punctual betting addicts were present, the practice yards echoed with sounds that defied easy categorization. It was the whistle of fossilized bone cutting through air at velocities that suggested serious intent. It was the rhythmic percussion of ancient weapons testing their edges against training posts that had been designed to withstand modern alloy. Most disturbing of all, it was the sound of human laughter, the sort of laughter that suggested someone had just realized they were going to have significantly more fun than originally anticipated. The Dracthul Fangs moved through their katas with liquid grace, extensions of human will translated into fossilized death. Each strike carried the weight of 60 million years of evolutionary perfection, guided by a species that had turned warfare into an art form before they discovered fire. The few early observers who witnessed these dawn rehearsals departed with expressions typically reserved for individuals who had just received disturbing medical diagnoses. Word began to spread through the more perceptive elements of galactic society that perhaps, just perhaps, the upcoming matches might not unfold exactly as advertised. The Emperor remained blissfully unaware of these developments, secure in his certainty that Decree 847b had finally solved his human problem. After all, what harm could they possibly do with prehistoric bones?
The answer to that question arrived with all the subtlety of a supernova at a candlelight dinner. The first match pitted a human male against a Krillian shock trooper, a species known for their natural electrical discharge and their unfortunate tendency to explode when sufficiently agitated. The betting boards displayed odds of 6,000 to 1 in favor of the alien, which represented either supreme confidence or a collective failure to understand basic probability theory. The human entered the arena carrying what appeared to be 2 curved sticks, fossilized relics that drew snickers from the crowd and actual laughter from the Christine delegation. The Krillian, meanwhile, crackled with bioelectric energy and flexed appendages that could punch through starship hull plating. It was the sort of matchup that military strategists would classify as hilariously one-sided, and medical personnel would describe as bring extra cleaning supplies. What happened next defied several laws of physics and at least 3 principles of common sense. The human moved with a fluidity that suggested he had been studying the Krillian species for considerably longer than the 3 rotations he had been imprisoned. The first Dracthul Fang found the creature's primary neural cluster with surgical precision, bypassing its electrical field through a gap in the bioelectric matrix that evolution had apparently forgotten to armor. The Krillian's death was swift, efficient, and accompanied by a light show that would have been impressive at a concert venue. The crowd fell silent with the sort of stunned quiet that typically preceded either standing ovations or mass panic. The human stood over his opponent's twitching remains, casually cleaning fossilized bone on alien hide, and the betting boards began updating with the frantic energy of economic systems realizing they had seriously miscalculated something important. The second match featured a human female against a Vorthak berserker, one of the Empire's own enhanced warriors, who had volunteered for genetic modification that made him roughly the size and temperament of an angry mountain. The berserker entered the arena to thunderous applause, flexing muscles that had been specifically designed to intimidate opponents into submission through sheer mass alone. His opponent carried a single Dracthul Fang bound with salvaged leather, and she moved with the sort of casual confidence that suggested she had already decided how this encounter would conclude. The berserker's charge covered 30 meters in approximately 2 seconds, which would have been impressive if the human had remained in the same location for the duration of his dramatic approach. Instead, she demonstrated the sort of tactical mobility that had made her species the terror of 17 star systems. The Dracthul Fang opened the berserker from shoulder to sternum in a single flowing motion that combined physics, anatomy, and what could charitably be described as performance art. The crowd's cheers died in their throats as 200 kilograms of genetically enhanced warrior discovered that evolution trumped engineering every single time.
By the third match, the betting parlors had suspended wagering on human contests pending what they termed market stabilization, which was economist speak for "we have no idea what's happening and we're too frightened to guess." The Christine delegation had upgraded their recording equipment and were now documenting events with the sort of academic intensity typically reserved for natural disasters or political scandals. The Emperor himself descended to the arena floor for the fourth match, which had originally been scheduled as a showcase execution featuring his personal champion against 3 humans simultaneously. The Bone Crusher had been looking forward to this engagement for months, having developed what psychiatrists would classify as an unhealthy fixation on the therapeutic benefits of dismembering mammals. What he encountered instead was a tactical problem that his genetic designers had failed to anticipate. The humans had learned to fight as a coordinated unit, their Dracthal weapons moving in patterns that suggested they had been practicing for considerably longer than their imprisonment should have allowed. They circled the champion with predatory grace, fossilized fangs catching arena lights in ways that suggested they were eager to taste imperial blood. The Bone Crusher's first mistake was assuming that prehistoric weapons would behave like primitive weapons. His second mistake was treating humans like any other species he had previously dismantled for entertainment purposes. His third and final mistake was failing to appreciate that evolution had already solved the problem of efficient killing. It just took intelligence to properly apply the solution. The Dracthal fangs found every gap in his enhanced anatomy with surgical precision. 60 million years of predatory evolution guided each strike, turning fossilized bone into instruments of precision death that made modern weapons seem crude by comparison. The champion fell in segments, his genetic modifications proving inadequate against tools that had been perfected when his species was still learning to make fire. The crowd's reaction progressed through several distinct phases of psychological adjustment. Initial shock gave way to nervous laughter, which evolved into uncomfortable silence, which finally transformed into something approaching awe. The humans had not simply won their matches, they had redefined the fundamental nature of arena combat, using weapons older than most civilizations. Emperor Thakmol watched his champion die with the expression of someone who had just realized that his clever plan had backfired in ways that would require extensive paperwork to properly document. Decree 84-7b, which had seemed so brilliantly vindictive just rotations earlier, now appeared to have accomplished the exact opposite of its intended effect. Instead of humiliating the humans, he had provided them with weapons that made steel seem quaint by comparison. The arena's medical staff, meanwhile, was discovering that fossilized Dracthal fangs created wounds unlike anything in their experience. The edges were sharper than molecular blades, the curves were perfectly optimized for maximum tissue damage, and the psychological impact on surviving opponents was what trauma specialists termed extensively counterproductive to future combat effectiveness. Word began spreading through the galactic communication networks with the speed that only genuine shock could achieve. The humans hadn't just adapted to their circumstances, they had turned archaeological research into a tactical advantage and transformed paleontology into a military discipline. Species across the galaxy began receiving reports that defied easy categorization, filed under headings like urgent, humans are doing that thing again, and immediate attention required evolutionary weaponry deployment. The few xenobiologists who had studied human behavior recognized the pattern immediately. This was what happened when you told a species that had conquered their homeworld's food chain that they couldn't use their favorite tools. They didn't surrender, they innovate. They didn't adapt to your rules, they rewrote the fundamental principles underlying your assumptions. As the arena staff prepared for the next rotation of matches, one fact had become abundantly clear to everyone except the Emperor himself. Banning steel hadn't solved the human problem. It had simply reminded the galaxy why humans had become a problem in the first place. The Dracthal fangs gleamed in their wielders' hands, prehistoric death made manifest, and the betting boards remained ominously silent. Emperor Thakmol XIX had ruled the Vorthak Empire for 12 rotations, during which time he had conquered 14 star systems, subjugated 23 species, and maintained a perfect record of never being personally embarrassed by members of his own gladiatorial entertainment complex. This impressive streak was about to end in spectacular fashion, witnessed by roughly 2 million spectators and broadcast live across 17 sectors of the galaxy. The final match had been intended as a grand finale, a triumphant demonstration of imperial superiority that would cement the Emperor's reputation as the galaxy's premier authority on creative violence. Instead, it had become something considerably more complex, a lesson in evolutionary biology delivered at lethal velocities by a species that treated extinction-level challenges as opportunities for professional development. The Terrans stepped into the arena carrying both primary Dractyl fangs, their fossilized curves catching the artificial sunlight in ways that suggested they remembered what it felt like to taste living prey. She had bound them with leather strips salvaged from a dozen different sources, creating grips that fit her hands as if they had been custom designed by 60 million years of natural selection, which technically they had been. Her opponent was something the Empire had imported specially for this occasion, a Nethak destroyer, a cybernetic horror from the Outer Rim that stood 3 meters tall and possessed enough military hardware to level a small city. It had been constructed rather than born, designed by engineers who believed that the solution to any tactical problem involved adding more weapons and armor until the original problem ceased to exist through overwhelming firepower. The creature's weapon systems included plasma cannons, molecular disruptors, kinetic accelerators, and what appeared to be a small nuclear device mounted where most species kept their live. Its armor had been forged from materials that existed only in the hearts of dying stars, and its targeting systems could track individual photons across interstellar distances. It was, by any reasonable measure, the most dangerous thing that had ever entered the Grand Colosseum. The Terran looked at this mechanical apocalypse, hefted her prehistoric fangs and smiled with the sort of expression that suggested she had just been presented with an interesting puzzle rather than an imminent death sentence. The crowd held its collective breath, the betting boards flickered uncertainly, and somewhere in the depths of imperial bureaucracy, a junior statistician began composing what would become known as the "I tried to warn them" memorandum. The battle began with the destroyer unleashing enough firepower to glass a continent, which would have been an effective opening gambit if its target had remained stationary long enough to be hit by the barrage. Instead, the Terran demonstrated the sort of tactical mobility that had made her ancestors the terror of African savannas back when the most advanced technology was pointed sticks and creative profanity. She moved through the plasma discharge like liquid mercury, the Dractyl fangs cutting through energy barriers that should have been impenetrable to anything short of antimatter weaponry. The fossilized bone seemed to exist in a state of physical impossibility, slicing through force fields and deflecting particle beams with casual indifference to the laws of physics that govern such interaction. The destroyer's targeting systems, designed to track objects moving at significant fractions of light speed, found themselves unable to predict the movements of something that appeared to be making tactical decisions based on pure instinct rather than logical analysis. Every time the machine calculated her probable location, she had already moved to somewhere that shouldn't have been tactically possible. The first Dractyl fang found the gap between the destroyer's primary armor plates, sliding through quantum-hardened ceramics as if they were made of paper rather than materials that could withstand stellar radiation. The second fang followed milliseconds later, targeting the creature's main processing core with the sort of precision that suggested the wielder had been studying cybernetic anatomy for considerably longer than her imprisonment should have allowed. The destroyer's death was both instantaneous and spectacular, involving several cascading system failures that resulted in what military engineers termed catastrophic existence failure. The explosion was visible from orbit and required emergency medical attention for spectators in the first dozen rows, not because they were physically injured, but because witnessing the event had apparently caused several species to question fundamental assumptions about reality. The silence that followed was the sort of quiet that typically preceded either religious revelations or mass resignation. 2 million spectators sat in stunned contemplation of what they had just witnessed, while the Emperor stared at the smoking crater where his ultimate weapon had been demonstrating the effectiveness of prehistoric dental work. The Terran stood at the center of the arena, Dractyl fangs still gleaming in her hands, and delivered what historians would record as the shortest victory speech in gladiatorial history. She looked directly at the Imperial viewing box and said, "Steel was never the point." This statement would require extensive philosophical analysis by academic committees across the galaxy, but its immediate tactical implications were clear enough. The humans hadn't needed modern weapons to prove their effectiveness. They had simply needed the opportunity to demonstrate what they could accomplish when properly motivated. Removing steel from the equation hadn't weakened them. It had forced them to remember why they had become the galaxy's most successful invasive species in the first. Emperor Thakmal descended to the arena floor with the expression of someone who had just realized that his clever plan had created problems that would require considerable creative thinking to resolve. The Terran waited for him with the sort of patient confidence that suggested she had already anticipated this moment, and prepared several different responses depending on how the conversation developed. Decree 8047B is hereby rescinded. the Emperor announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the sort of forced casualness that suggested he was hoping everyone would forget the last several hours had happened. All gladiators may resume using standard metallic weaponry, effective immediate. The Terran examined her Dracthal fangs thoughtfully, running her thumb along edges that had just carved through the most advanced military technology the galaxy had to offer.
"That's very generous," she replied, "but I think we'll keep
The Emperor's expression suggested he had just realized that rescinding the decree wouldn't actually solve the fundamental problem he had created. The humans now possessed weapons that made steel seem quaint by comparison, and more importantly, they had demonstrated that removing their preferred tools didn't make them less dangerous. It made them creative in ways that kept military strategists awake at night. Within hours, reports began flooding in from across the Empire. Human settlements were requesting archaeological surveys. Mining operations were reporting unusual interest in fossilized remains. Most disturbing of all, several human colonies had begun what they termed paleontological research initiatives that seemed to involve extensive excavation of ancient predator burial sites. The galaxy's xenobiologists updated their files on human behavior to include a new category: weaponization of archaeological resources. The entry noted that attempting to limit human access to modern tools appeared to trigger what researchers termed evolutionary regression response, resulting in the tactical deployment of increasingly primitive but devastatingly effective alternatives. The Vorthak Empire's official records would eventually classify the entire incident under administrative learning experiences, buried deep enough in bureaucratic archives that future historians would require advanced archaeological techniques to uncover the full story. The irony of this filing system would not be lost on the humans who eventually discovered it, though by then they had moved on to weaponizing other aspects of natural history. Emperor Thakmal retired to his private chambers that evening to contemplate the philosophical implications of Decree 8047b and its unintended consequences. He had intended to humiliate the humans by removing their modern weapons. Instead, he had reminded the galaxy why evolution had spent 60 million years perfecting the art of killing, and why humans were disturbingly good at recognizing effective solutions regardless of their age. The Dracthal Fangs hung in the Terran's cell that night, prehistoric death waiting patiently for the next opportunity to demonstrate that sometimes the old ways were the best ways. Outside, the galaxy continued its rotation, blissfully unaware that humanity had just added paleontology to their already extensive list of military sciences. After all, what was the worst that could happen when you taught humans to weaponize natural history? The universe, with its characteristic sense of timing, was about to provide another comprehensive answer to that question.